The 90s and the 2000s in cycling history are really dark times. Fucking everyone was on gear. A number of cycling's biggest stars ended up dying from drug overdoses. I think Lance was clearly an incredible cyclist. He was the best of his generation. He was the Michael Jordan, or kind of the Michael Phelps or LeBron James of cycling at that time. He took it up a notch. Everyone in the sport is still following in his footsteps, not in the doping context, but just in the professionalism, the way he took the sport. As a human being, I think he's pretty repulsive in the way he treated people. And I think there are so many things he did when people were trying to just tell the truth, just simply trying to tell the truth about him, that are just like unforgivable. We could go into there's so many examples of it. I wouldn't have that opinion about him as a human if it was just doping, because at the time, doping was a part of the sport. Most of the cyclists who doped also managed to be decent people, which might be a bit jarring to hear, but it was simply just part of the sport. And I think doping, this is kind of a longer conversation, but I think doping is probably still part of most professional sports. But I think Lance is a bad person because of how he treated people. I don't know, he's tried to make amends for his wrongs, and I commend him for doing that. And I think everyone deserves a chance of forgiveness. But I think when he was in the limelight and when he had to make tough decisions, he pretty universally made the wrong decision in terms of how to treat people. So
yeah, and what were those? Because I watched it, and like, weirdly enough, I sort of came away thinking, this is a guy who's really flawed, but he's kind of trying his hardest to be a better person now.
I think he has actually made efforts. One of his main competitors was a guy called Jan Ullrich, and Jan Ullrich finished his cycling career. He was like the biggest star in Germany. He was like Germany's most famous sporting icon, up there with kind of the footballers. He had a troubled life after cycling, fell into a life of kind of drug abuse and in and out of rehab and a lot of challenges. But so I just read a book about Jan Ullrich. It's a fascinating read. And the book talks a lot about how Jan Ullrich, or how Lance, has been helping his former rival, the guy who he used to fight on a bike with for 10 years. He's like one of Jan's sponsors and helps his recovery. And I think things like that point to he's kind of turned a corner and he's trying to be a better person. But he didn't do great things when he was on the top of the world, and that's how you can judge him as well.
And what that guy Jan Ullrich, because I find it interesting with the first person ever to summit Everest, alongside the British explorer Tenzing Norgay. He was obviously like a very good athlete. You know, he did something that no one else had ever done. But similarly, once he did that, he sort of fell into this life of just like substance abuse. I think he died as an alcoholic. What is it about these like ultra high athletes that means as soon as the show stops, they just disintegrate?
People of all walks of life, from very successful people to just kind of anyone, can have substance abuse problems. I think a lot of it, like I'm not an expert in it, but I think a lot of it stems in childhood. And if you have a challenging childhood, I was reading this book, like Jan Ullrich, the guy we're speaking about, he had a pretty difficult childhood. He was very sheltered, didn't have much of a relationship with his father, becomes kind of this world famous athlete. But also he has all these people around him making every decision for him. So he never really has to think for himself. When he was in a period of kind of like heavy cycling, and even after his career, he would still stay fit and do lots of riding. That would be good for his like mental health and his kind of like his not touching drugs. And then when he'd get like a knee injury or a back injury or something, that's when he would kind of turn back to drugs. And so that was interesting because like he kind of either had his physical health or his or he would spiral down. I think like now he's in a much better place. I think he's been pretty clean or whatever. And I think like Lance has been supporting him. Like the 90s and the 2000s in cycling history are really dark times because fucking everyone was on gear. Like everyone was just ripping drugs because there's effectively no regulation, and people were taking so much EPO, steroids, blood transfusions, everything they could get their hands on to go as fast on a bike as possible. A number of cycling's biggest stars ended up dying from drug overdoses. So Frank van den Broek, like he was this Belgium like superstar until I can't remember if he died in a car accident or drug overdose. Marco Pantani, who was effectively Italy's biggest athlete at a time when their soccer teams were doing incredibly well too. He failed a doping test in his home race, the Giro d'Italia. The entire country of Italy ostracized him and said, "You are our hero, now we hate you." Kind of like that. And he was a very insecure guy. As like a lot of cyclists, I don't think he had like much of a social life, became like a superstar. And then got ostracized for doping, which everyone else around him was doing. I think he took that like incredibly personally. He's like very sensitive, fell into horrible like drug abuse, ended up dying from a drug overdose. I think the sport's a lot cleaner. That was all kind of probably the nadir of it was 20 years ago. Since then, drug testing has become a lot stricter.